Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about Nehemiah.
Hey, my friends, it's Matt. Thanks for hanging out with me and talking about the book of Nehemiah today. And Nehemiah, as we talked about yesterday when we were looking at Ezra, is an interesting animal because it isn't a book unto itself in its original form. It's the second half of one unified book that is now split into Ezra and Nehemiah. And at the simplest level, it's the story of how Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the great King of Kings, the King of Persia, receives permission to go back as an exile to Jerusalem and to oversee the rebuilding of the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Doesn't sound like that big a deal or that big a project to you and me because, I don't know, why do you need walls around a city? Like, what's that going to do? Why does it matter? But you got to not think modernly here. You got to think about the ancient world. A city without walls wasn't a city. A city without walls couldn't protect, say, a sacred temple inside those city limits. The walls are what kept it from being toppled by even just a few men or a band of brigands who were looking for an easy city to sack. No walls in the ancient world meant your city was not legit. And so all the work that's recorded in Ezra involving the building and dedication of the temple and the reestablishment of the covenant people of Israel, all of that's going to be a moot point really quickly here. It's inevitably going to get wrecked again at the hands of somebody who doesn't appreciate all that went into it and all that it represents if you don't get some walls up around it. So the book of Nehemiah opens with Nehemiah being made aware of the broken down state of the walls and the fact that the gates, which would have been made of heavy timbers, are all burned. And he's deeply saddened by this. So we get a little bit more sense of how big a deal walls were, because if Nehemiah is a socially competent enough man to ascend all the way to the level of trusted behind-the-scenes servant of the King of Kings, the King of the world, he's a socially competent enough man not to just fall apart and bawl because, oh, my walls got hit, oh, my door burned. It couldn't just mean what it means to you and me. It must have meant something much bigger. And I think indeed what it meant is what we were talking about just a minute ago. The project isn't done. The city has people in it and has a temple, but it's not a real city. And Nehemiah knows that the first time the Persians aren't able to keep an eye on it, it's going to get toppled, conquered, and sent back to ruin. And Nehemiah at this point would have been familiar with everything that went into getting Jerusalem back, even to the modest state that it is in now. That building meant more to them than you and I think of buildings meaning to us today. So the book opens with Nehemiah hanging out with a new king of Persia who we have met. His name has cropped up in the book of Ezra. His name is Artaxerxes, and we know from history that he was a man who was very sensitive to the needs of his people. What a wonderful reputation to have handed down through time about you, to be a man who had so much power, and admittedly at times wielded it with ferocious force, but generally speaking, to be a man who had so much power and to rule with a posture and attitude and bent toward peace and empathy. That's a very remarkable thing. The Bible treats Artaxerxes very well, and history treats him very well, so that squares up pretty neatly for me. And we actually get a pretty tender look at Artaxerxes in a vulnerable human situation when Nehemiah shows up and his face tells the story of Nehemiah being sad. And Artaxerxes is like, what's going on, man? You're not sick, and yet your face is downcast. You're not like that. What's happening? And Nehemiah is like, how can I smile when I know that the walls of my home city where the graves of my fathers are is torn down and that the gates are burned? And Artaxerxes in this scene, like, clearly he knows what that means in the ancient world. Yeah, you can't have walls like that, and you can't have gates burned like that. And the graves of my good friend Nehemiah's fathers, they're going to end up getting desecrated, and that city's going to get wrecked. And so it's just beautiful. The way Artaxerxes, he doesn't negotiate or anything. His answer to Nehemiah telling him what's going on is just say, how long would it take you to get there? How long do you think you would need to stay? Wow. Have you ever had somebody in a position of authority just give you the green light on something so graciously and so quickly? I've only got a few minutes to cover this, but this scene touches me so much that I'm taking a disproportionately large amount of time on it. Let's move forward. Nehemiah goes back to Jerusalem, discovers that the walls are indeed, as he's heard reported, in very bad repair. And he figures out which people are going to be loyal and do something about it. And then we get this cool story of him whipping people into shape and different groups, almost like that adopt a highway thing that we have in my country, where it's like this mile of highway was adopted by the Daughters of American Liberty of Springfield, Nebraska, and they like go out there and they clean it up. Well, we kind of get the same kind of stuff in Nehemiah. It's like this particular gate was adopted by the sons of these people, and the dung gate was fixed up by the people of this town, and just sounds like everybody really rallied together and got something going, and not much had been happening here for a long time, which means that this is maybe a good place to step back for a moment and talk timeline just so that we're oriented here, because we're talking about events that cover a century when we deal with Ezra and Nehemiah. So again, Cyrus the Persian conquered the Babylonians in 539 BC. In the first year of his reign, so what would that be, 538, maybe still 539? He gives permission for the exiles to go home. That's what we get in the book of Ezra. The exiles go under the leadership of Zerubbabel, and they get a lot of stuff done in the early going. They get the altar up and running, they get the temple going. But then, just 3 years after Cyrus's conquest of Babylon, that work grinds to a halt. The whole empire goes through some crazy stuff in 530 when Cyrus the Great dies, but Darius eventually realizes that Cyrus had given permission, and he reinitiates the building of the temple around 520. The temple is then completed in 516, and then we fast forward past the rest of the reign of Darius, the famous reign of Xerxes, who fought against the Greeks and King Leonidas, and we get a good ways into the reign of Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes, who is the guy who allows Ezra to go and nurture the people and teach them the law of God. 12 or 13 years later, still under the reign of Artaxerxes, Nehemiah, the king's cupbearer, goes and joins Ezra. They overlap for a little while in Jerusalem, and Nehemiah begins work on these walls in 445. So Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon 539. Now we're all the way up to 445. So there's a big chunk of time that we've covered here. Well, at this point in the story, Nehemiah is going to encounter the same thing that Zerubbabel encountered and that Ezra encountered, and that is opposition to the thing they were commissioned by the King of Kings, the King of Persia, to go and do. In Nehemiah's case, the opposition comes from a whole bunch of neighboring people who are like, oh, dang, we do not want to see Jerusalem get up to her knees and stand to her feet. That is a powerful city with a powerful history, and it is not good for us if they get those walls built. And so the enemies of the Jewish people in Jerusalem, their neighbors, they want to keep Jerusalem down. And apparently they don't feel like they have as much recourse in terms of exploiting the bureaucratic state to accomplish that, so they just go with violence. And Nehemiah ends up having to use half of his wall builders just to defend the wall builders with swords and spears and bows. During the building process, everybody's wearing a sword on their hip the whole time. It sounds like there was trouble constantly, but the walls get built in 445. As the walls are getting completed, Ezra stands outside one of the gates and does this reading and interpreting of the law for everyone. So it's like another covenant renewal, saying we got to get this stuff right. All of these walls and all of this temple, it's all for nothing if we don't understand the law and we don't understand where we fit into this story. Nehemiah 8:8 specifically addresses how that reading of the law went. It says, they read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. Look, I got my biases. Obviously, I'm kind of a fan of the idea of looking at the Bible and reading it and then carefully trying to get the sense of it together in a group setting. I'm into that sort of thing. So I really resonate with this particular verse, but there's power in it. The people understood. It's like when King Josiah rediscovered the book of the law and it made sense to him and it clicked and it broke his heart and it changed him. Well, the same thing happens here toward the end of Nehemiah. The people hear it and they're like, we destroyed something beautiful as a people, and now we're going through the hard work of putting it back together, but we're still making some of the mistakes that destroyed it in the first place. And so along with the reading of the law and the official dedication of the completed wall and services for the first time being held in the temple that is now protected and enclosed fully by the wall, you get yet another thing that kind of feels like a renewal of the covenant back in Deuteronomy, and you get another uncomfortable, but some would say necessary. Others would say over corrective purging of intermarriages between the pagan outsiders and the Jewish exiles. And what we see coming out of this is the beginnings of the temple culture and the very law-oriented, legalistic religious culture of Jesus' time, characterized by the Pharisees. And the take-home from all of it is, yeah, they're doing the right thing to try and go rebuild something beautiful. Yes, God seems to be directing the heart of the great kings of Persia to support this effort, but also there's no evidence that God showed up to live in that temple again the way he did before. And that does kind of linger with you as you move on from these books. Like we talked about, Ezra and Nehemiah is a composite of a whole bunch of bureaucratic documents, receipts, inventory lists, and also memoirs, most noticeably from Ezra and Nehemiah themselves. So at times we get first-person recordings of their actions and even of their prayers. And in this case, it sort of ends with a prayer/diary entry from Nehemiah. This is the closeout of the whole Ezra-Nehemiah thing. He says, "Thus I cleansed them from everything foreign, and I established the duties of the priests and Levites, each in his work, and I provided for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good." And that is where I most resonate with these guys. I have destroyed beautiful things, and I've tried to redeem those beautiful things that I've had a hand in destroying. But that's a messy work, and it never quite feels like you nailed it. And in the end of one of those kind of ordeals that you've probably gone through as well, there isn't much more that you can do than say, I squared accounts with everybody I could square accounts with. I did my best to get this thing right. Please remember me, oh my God, for good. When you visualize Nehemiah, visualize the city walls of Jerusalem. When you think about the theme of Nehemiah, think about that last verse of the book that I just read. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, I recommend reading the first and last chapter where you get that tender interaction with the King of Kings, Artaxerxes, and where you get Nehemiah looking back and reflecting on all that's happened. Look at that. Achievement unlocked. We've got Nehemiah now. Congratulations on leveling up with me. Okay, we're going to experience quite the tonal shift as we enter the court of the Persian king Xerxes next time around in the beloved book of Esther. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.